Hello everyone, welcome to the Packaging Best Practice Mashup, part 2 of the series that the IBA Quality Project Group has put together. If you missed part 1, members can jump onto the website under the resources tab and check it all out. But for now, part 2, I'll introduce Claire Clouting, who will be hosting the session. Claire is on the IBA board. Claire, how are you going? I am great, thanks. It's exciting to be talking about quality. It's such an important issue, so I'm always glad to be sharing these with our members. I'll leave it to you, but if anyone has any questions in the chat, just drop them into the chat there and I can pass them through to the team. Claire, all yours.
Thank you. Really excited to be talking about packaging quality today. And I've got two great experts with me. I've got Thomas Parker from Stone & Wood. So Thomas looks after quality at Stone & Wood, and he previously worked at CUB also. And I've got Anthony Clem from Well Brewed. He used to be the head brewer at Hemingway Brewery and also has done some quality work at Lion before as well. So should be a good conversation today. I wanted to kick off really just talking overall about what happens at the end of a quality issue with regards to things like recalls and stuff. So what sort of packaging issues do you think, and I'll pass this to Anthony first, what sort of packaging issues are we looking at that cause recalls or withdrawals in the trade for our industry in particular?
So I guess the main ones we're looking at are food safety related issues, Claire. So anything that's going to cause a risk to the consumer from a safety perspective, that's probably going to instigate a recall. And they're expensive ones, so you've got to publicly acknowledge that there's an issue and recall from trade and retail, etc. Kinds of things that can occur with those types of things are you've got contamination from chemicals, or you've got secondary fermentation or fermentation occurring in the package, which is going to then lead to a health risk or a safety risk with cans or bottles exploding. And then I guess from a withdrawal perspective, it is up to it may not be a food safety risk, but it is up to the supplier to withdraw their product from the shelves, and they may be forced to if you've got like seam leaks or something like that, or you've got something that's got had a lot of feedback on it that it's contaminated and the product's not true to type and is therefore quite brand damaging to be out in the market. So they're the kinds of things that we've seen in the past. So yeah, your contamination from caustic or other chemicals, secondary fermentation has been a big one, which we've talked about a little bit. And then some of the other issues could be glass in bottle or other contamination where there's a physical risk to the consumer. So they're the kinds of things that we need to be really looking out for, and that's what you should probably you should cover off if you've got a HACCP HACCP process in place at the brewery. You'd be looking at those critical control points to make sure that you're mitigating the risk of ever having that occur, because it's a very expensive one.
Yes, it is. And from experience, I know from working in another industry that when you get to the point of doing a recall, it's often very difficult to get all of the product back. I know a previous place I worked, they issued a recall and it was in national newspapers and posters in stores, and still only got sort of 1 in 5 actually returned. So it's a bit like shutting the door after the horse has bolted, so to speak. But withdrawals, I suppose, must be a little bit easier because are you able to sort of explain to everybody who's watching what a withdrawal is with regards to comparison with a recall?
So a withdrawal with a recall, recalls are centered around food safety issues mainly, or risk to the consumer. So that means like you say, you've got to let the consumer know that there is a problem so that they can actually get product that they've purchased off the retail shelves back to you or disposed of. So the difference with that and a withdrawal is that you're withdrawing from your warehouses or your distribution outlets or even retail stores without going to the general public. So they are significantly cheaper and less brand damaging, so to speak, because there's less exposure in the media, I suppose. But similarly, they can be very costly because you may be damaging your relationships with your third-party logistics or your retail distribution outlets that you're stocking your product in. So still damaging, and if they're visual issues like seam leaks, where the general public and consumers are seeing this, and the retail guys are seeing this as well, then you give yourself quite a bad name, don't you, within those outlets and with the consumers that have seen and purchased those products of yours. So the difference are quite marked. That one's public knowledge and the other one's more your retailers and distributors and warehouses. But it does come down to serious traceability, doesn't it? We'll probably talk about that a bit later. But they're the main differences.
Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, sometimes, because obviously you don't want to sour the relationship with your customers, so like Woolworths and Coles and stuff. But I also think there's probably a bit of an integrity there thing where I guess it might show as a business that you're willing to do what's necessary, for quality, as long as you're not withdrawing too many times.
Yeah.
Hopefully the customer would see it as, your business is obviously, passionate about quality, and it's important not to disappoint the consumer, but probably a difficult thing to weigh up. Have you ever gone through a withdrawal or recall?
Yes. Yeah, I've been through numerous withdrawals, both at Lion and with a craft brewery I was with, Hemingway's in North Queensland. And I've seen some recalls as well, just in my career at Lion. So, and I think there's certainly a right and wrong way to go about it. A recall is extremely intensive, and we used to practice recalls, and it would take, it would be a week of just planning and making all the phone calls and doing all the right things that you have to do to notify the media, etc. So they're huge. If you have to go through a recall, then the time and money and effort that it takes is significant. So getting the message right to consumers is extremely important. And I think most of the time with beer, we are quite lucky if you're not, unless there's something catastrophic that occurs, you're really in withdrawal mode. Yeah, we have seen some issues, obviously, with secondary fermentation that does cause that recall to occur. But beyond that, withdrawal is probably the best approach. And if you can sell it in the way that you are trying to make sure that you're keeping everyone safe, but you're also making sure that the quality of your beer is paramount, and you're trying to do all the right things and take responsibility for it. It can be perceived as a good thing, but obviously you don't want it to occur on a regular basis. It needs to be a one-off or a very, 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 very rare occurrence. So, I think but definitely you do need to speak to the media and make sure that you are certainly conveying that message that you're doing it for quality reasons, especially if it's a withdrawal of your own volition. So if you're deciding because of a quality issue, and that might be flavour, that it's brand damaging, then absolutely. Make sure that you convey it to the consumer in a way that's seen in a positive quality light.
Yep. And I've definitely seen some really good examples of that recently, particularly in craft breweries, and seen it talked about in Facebook groups, where it's actually had a positive impact and the consumers have been like, yep, good on them for doing it. So I think there's some really good examples out there. If people are looking for being pointed in the right direction, just give me a shout. I won't out people here, but it can be handled in a very positive manner, I think. You touched on seaming, and that is an interesting challenge, and it's not always obvious. Thomas, I'm going to come to you now. So picking up on seaming issues can be very challenging at times. What can we do? And I'm going to talk all different scales here, from low cost up to, a fairly decent cost. What can we do to pick up on seaming issues and sort of spot them before they're out in the trade and become a problem?
Yeah, so here at Stone and Wood, we, I guess, started off using mobile canners and then moved up to having our own can line. And we sort of scaled up in terms of how we were monitoring those seams. The problem is they don't manifest themselves as a problem until they're out in your DCs and on the shelf. So being proactive about monitoring for seaming issues from the get-go is important. Some of the simpler approaches I've seen and we've used is a hot water bucket immersion, where you put the can into a bucket of hot water. That basically mimics tunnel pasteurization in a way. It brings the internal pressure of the can right up and promotes any leaking. So yeah, I should mention that's one of the big challenges we face in the craft sector. Not many of us tunnel pasteurize, and tunnel pasteurization itself is a good way of testing the seam. Also, just even just feeling the seam is an important and quick check. And even in the advanced sort of seaming inspection packages you can get, that's always the first step that they encourage you to do. So a visual and a feel of the seam. And then you step up into getting more sophisticated. You can cut the seam open, and there's a lot of ways to achieve this. And inspecting the folds of the seam using either a handheld micrometer or calipers, or you can invest in a seam inspection camera. And that's the method we've gone down here at Stone and Wood. So we're using a CMC seam inspection camera, and it's very robust, but obviously it requires an investment.
Yeah, same here at Gauge. We started off with a micrometer though, and it did the job. It was, it was pretty good as long as people were properly trained on how to use it. And a pair of digital calipers these days, you can pick up for about $500, a decent pair. But yeah, so I suppose if you go like to the automated and the camera, we're probably talking just in the tens of thousands, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
So I guess it's in scale for what you're doing, but I'm pretty sure everybody can afford a bucket of water.
Yes, yeah. And we've all got a hot liquor tank, so.
Yeah, that's good. And I always like to emphasize as well, about this is the thing, we talk about retention samples a lot, when we're discussing quality, and there's all sorts of good reasons for having them, but retention samples are great from that perspective, going back and revisiting them and seeing how you're going. You mentioned mobile canning, and obviously a lot of our members would use mobile canning. Is there challenges around that, or have you got any tips around, working with mobile canners to make sure that things like the seam and the quality of the cans are at a good level?
Sure. I mean, I guess by engaging a mobile canner, it's a partnership, right? And it shouldn't be seen as one way. It's a two-way relationship, and we had a really good relationship with the mobile canners we employed to help us, and when an issue comes up, working closely with them to address it. We maintain some oversight of the quality checks, because we already had a bottle line in place, and obviously we're used to testing routinely during the bottle filling process. We applied as many of those checks as we could to the canning line when we were running it. But yeah, I think just working closely with them and ensuring some of these checks that we're discussing are being done is important.
Yep. Well, thank you for that. And while we're talking canning, is there any other, and this is open to either of you, is there any other canning checks that you think people should consider other than seaming?
Well, we do the other checks that we, as I mentioned, do for our bottles. So we've got impact carbon dioxide content, and there's a few means of doing that. We monitor dissolved oxygen, and which I think we'll get to, and also we look at an impact pressure tester, so where we raise the pressure internally, which is somewhat similar to throwing a can in a bucket of hot water, but it's doing it in a controlled manner. So you're basically putting a needle into the can and injecting air at a specific pressure, but doing it so slowly, so it's sort of representative of what would happen on a shelf. You're not going to see an immediate increase in pressure like dumping it in a hot bucket of water that you would see out on a shelf. So yeah, we do that, and we do that for our bottles as well. And some people mention it's a little hard to do a can in an impact pressure tester, but we've just found with a little care you can do it. You've got to ramp it a little slower and hold it at a lower pressure, given that cans are generally rated lower than a bottle anyway.
Yep, that's a good point. And I think we actually have some details on that on our fact sheet.
Yep.
I think there's a small section and it includes a photo of the type of equipment you're talking about. We've certainly got one at Gauge, but we don't use it for cans, but I'm going to give it a go now and see if we can get it going. Thank you. And
I think just visually inspecting them as well, Claire. So anything that's coming on site, just having a good look over the pallet and just checking for any damage. So, you know, we've picked up in the past where, you know, there's been a line down the side of a pallet where it's just been run into something by, you know, either forklift driver or during transport, whatever, and that's just caused dents right down the pallet. And if you were to not check the pallet at all, you would get these random samples come through that just would not seam, or you know, because they've got dents on the rolled over sections, the lips at the top of the can, and that's just going to prevent the can from seaming. So it's really important just to give those pallets a once over, both bottles and cans, and just check also all the packaging material around it. You know, they can impart, if it's been wet, it can impart all sorts of off aromas and flavors in the beer as well. So just making sure you visually inspect everything that's coming into your site, and you know, particularly before you put it on the pack line, that you've got no contamination and other issues. I mean, you can pick up a lot from just having a really good look, can't you? So I highly recommend it.
And your mention of dents specifically when it comes to cans is another important one. Yeah, yes, equally it might not enable you to seam, but dents in general can occur much more easily with the can, and it can compromise the lining on the inside of the can, which can lead to off-flavor development and leaks. So yeah, monitoring for dents right through the course of your entire line, and watching out where minor dents might be being introduced by the conveyors or the filler itself is very important for cans in particular.
Yep.
Absolutely, good call.
That is a really good point. And on top of that, then I'm going to add something to the mix often people don't think about, but I've seen in a few places, is where you're making cans or bottles equally. It's important to make sure that you have good lighting. because I've seen people working, you know, in areas and you're just relying on, you know, light coming through a window or something. The better the lighting in a production area, the more likely the guys working on that line are going to be at picking up things like dents and issues. You know, people really need to be able to see what they're doing, and it definitely helps with picking up quality issues, things like foreign objects as well. So that's just something to consider. Make sure that you've got really good lighting in all your production areas. It will make a difference.
And probably a good point for mobile canners in particular, because I've seen mobile canners set up in very interesting positions. It's amazing where they can pack into, but your point about lighting is something very good to consider when you're faced with that.
Yep. Thank you. Well, I think we'll move on to the other most common form of packaging, which is the bottles now. So there's a few issues, you know, that you can encounter with bottles, but the main one I can think of is crowns. Thomas, you still pack a lot of bottles over at Stone and Wood. So what are the key things around crowns? And how do you know if you've got a good crown and it's not going to cause you any issues out in the trade?
The primary measure we use is a no-go gauge, which essentially is just telling you whether the crimp is sufficient, as in it's not too tight or not too loose. And either direction can lead to problems with leaking, or equally, if it's too tight, you can get shearing of the lip when someone tries to open it. So yeah, that's the primary tool we employ. You can get a little more sophisticated in terms of the how you measure that. You can buy a gauge from ASBC, which gives you a greater range on the no-go scale, so it can tell you more specifically what diameter it's good at, or you can use calipers. And then there's the impact bottle pressure test, which we talked about earlier, more traditionally used on a bottle, and that's essentially helping to tell the integrity of your cap and seal as well.
And you can get your crimp gauge, I think, often if you contact your crown supplier, they'll point you in the right direction, because obviously they're calibrated, you know, piece of, well, the cutting, isn't it? So, and I guess the other thing that will really affect is oxygen. Anthony, I wanted to ask you about oxygen, because I know we wrote the oxygen best practice fact sheet together, and I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more. So obviously oxygen is a big problem in packaging, but particularly for us craft manufacturers, because of all the hops and everything, we're a little bit less stable in the presence of oxygen. Can you sort of help first off by just explaining, obviously we're dealing with dissolved oxygen, headspace oxygen and total pack. Are you able to sort of give the viewers a bit of an idea of what those three things actually mean and what we're referring to?
Sure, Claire. So dissolved oxygen is like the label. It is the amount of dissolved oxygen that is in the beer itself. So that can happen throughout the process, and we described a lot of those factors that it can lead to high dissolved oxygen in beer in that fact sheet. Headspace oxygen is the oxygen that's contained in the headspace itself. So if you've got a lot of oxygen that's not been purged out of your package, or you've got package exposed to oxygen in the atmosphere, then that's what's going to contribute to your headspace oxygen. So your lack of purging and those types of things. But that's what it is. It's specifically related to the headspace in the package and the oxygen in the gas. Then total package oxygen, and it's a tricky one. I know at the bigger breweries, it's what we use to measure, but there's probably a lot of craft breweries that don't use TPO, I would imagine. But I guess the idea behind TPO is it gives you the total package oxygen, and that's an equilibrated number that comes from a calculation, as well as equilibrating the oxygen in the headspace with the dissolved oxygen in the beer. So you're using an end over end turner for a number of minutes to just equilibrate the headspace in the package with the dissolved oxygen in the beer. And then you're using some calculations based on the volume of the headspace and those types of things to really give you a true TPO. But the factor, the reason you're measuring it is just to get an understanding of how much oxygen you're introducing to your beer through the headspace and through the filling process. So it's really a measurement after everything's said and done. It's in the package, and it's there to figure out whether you're really introducing beer throughout. You're introducing oxygen throughout the process. So that's the final oxygen in your package. When you're trying to troubleshoot, obviously throughout the process, you want to have a look at what your headspace oxygen is and what your dissolved oxygen is, and have a good understanding of how it's contributing to your TPO. So there's lots of different things that you can do to try and figure that out. And if you can analyse DO in your bright beer tank, and then headspace in your package, and then total package oxygen after it's been equilibrated, then it gives you some good understanding of where things are occurring and where to go troubleshooting. So are you looking at your purging? Are you looking at your seaming, etc.? Your blanketing of CO2 before seaming, capping, etc. So lots of different measurements there, I suppose, but they're all there to try and help you troubleshoot where the issues are occurring.
So with regard to if I did do some testing and I found that I've got a high headspace oxygen, I guess the kind of things I'd be looking at, then you mentioned CO2 blanketing and Thomas, what sort of areas do you look at if you guys, would find a high headspace oxygen?
Yeah, primarily the performance of the fobber. Our bottle filler doesn't really permit different fill heights, but that would also be another factor to go looking at. And yeah, in terms of monitoring headspace oxygen by measuring the equilibrated TPO, yeah, we do that routinely. So we do that every hour. At the same time, we do it unshaken, which is primarily a measure of the dissolved oxygen, and because you're waiting for the package to shake, it doesn't take much longer to do both anyway. So we do that routinely, and it's a good troubleshooting tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, if you compare your dissolved oxygen to your shaken oxygen result that you get, really the difference gives you an indication. I guess if it goes up, that indicates you've got some oxygen in the headspace somewhere. And I guess if it goes down, that can only be a good thing, right? With your packaging.
Yeah. On paper, in some ways, it doesn't make sense that it would go down. But I've come across some reading that, in the process of shaking it, and that's why it's important to have a consistent approach to shaking, whether it be a documented procedure that someone has to manually do, or whether it's an end-over-end shaker that Anthony mentioned, as long as you're doing it consistently, because that can impact that some of the oxygen gets absorbed by the beer in that process.
Yeah. And making sure you do it for long enough, I guess, if you're trying to get
it. Yeah, so it's a balance, right? You've got to get equilibration, but you also don't want to do it so long that beer starts being oxidized and the oxygen bound up and non-measurable.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, that's interesting. And I suppose it also, you want to make sure that you've sized your container correctly to the amount of product you're going to put in there, because you can only fob so much out or blanket so much CO2 onto there. So it's that fine line between not wanting to overfill, I guess, from a cost and legal perspective, but also not wanting to leave too much of a headspace there as well.
Yeah, I think getting rid of those really low fills as well. So if you've got a mechanism to to get rid of your really low fills that are occurring through the packaging process. You know those are going to be the worst off from a dissolved oxygen perspective because of the high headspace in them. So if you can remove those really low fills and not let them out into the retail world, then you're not going to have significant, because they can have a significant flavour impact. Just the difference between a low fill and a properly filled and purged and capped bottle or lid, seamed can has a big difference. It's quite marked, and you can easily pick it up between can to can. So
yeah,
it's one, if you can make sure that they're being removed and they're not sneaking into the pack line, then that's very useful.
And I guess at most of our level of breweries, having an automated means to do that is difficult. But even having it, most of us are not tunnel pasteurizing, as previously discussed, and that's another place where the tunnel pasteurization process actually helps those techniques of detecting underfills. So even if so, that's a challenge we face because we don't have a means of getting the liquid to settle out. The other thing I thought I'd mention is we have an automated means, yes, but even when the filler stops, there's two particular positions where the bottle will still make it out and it will look fine, but it's actually been sitting there getting air in the headspace, and our operators are really in tune to that, and they pick out those two particular bottles because even though they look fine from a fill height perspective, it's full of oxygen, and we've definitely seen that as having an impact on flavour.
definitely. I
really
think
good
that
point.
you break down, you really need to have good operators that understand what your protocols are if it breaks down, or how long they can leave stuff on the line if the machine stops, particularly with cans, because they've got so much more of a bigger surface area than bottles. You're right. Wouldn't be surprised me if if you're getting flavor complaints, you trace it back to a point at which maybe the line was stopped for 20 minutes or something like that, and those cans have found their way through. Sorry, Anthony, you were going to say something.
I thought it was just a very good point. Just understanding exactly what you said, Claire. Just understanding, obviously from a fill height perspective, when you get going again, you're generally having to check fill heights and make sure that you're weighing your cans or your bottles to make sure that you are presenting legal packages. But just that factor of removing the cans pre the issue that have sat on the line exposed, haven't got lids on them or uncapped, making sure you're removing all of those so that you're reducing the quality impact and variability just from package to package in the same batch. So a really important factor, and good administrative processes required to ensure that that's what's happening.
Yep. I guess if once you've got good fobbing, and particularly on cans and stuff, there is a side to that, in that you do have product going down the sides of the can or the bottle. So I was going to come on to the other issue, which I don't think necessarily cause withdrawals, it wouldn't, but it can lead to consumers being disappointed, and that is the sticky bottle and can, and I do see comments on Facebook and various places, people complaining about sticky cans and stuff. What are the main, I guess it's fairly obvious, but what would be your main pieces of advice around dealing with sticky cans and bottles?
Well, we have an external bottle can rinse, which runs off water that we reclaimed from our tray, from our RO system that comes out of our tray waste. But obviously that washes off any remaining beer or residue from the can or bottle, and that's our primary means of control for that. And then subsequent to that, we have a blower to dry as much as possible the can or bottle before it goes into its packaging. Yep. So that's primarily how we control for that.
I guess, yeah, the blower is probably as important in some cases as the washer. I know we've talked in the past about rusty crowns and various things, and I guess getting labels on cans and bottles that are still wet, it is a challenge. Anthony, have you got any comments on sticky cans or bottles?
Yeah, I think just making sure that you've got those, you've got fresh water going into that rinse, that rinser, and you've got your air knives set up so they are actually, drying all those areas. And I have seen spotting and things like that on lids and things in the past, and just making sure everything's as dry as possible, and after it's been rinsed with clean fresh water or water that's not going to leave any residues or marks on the package. It just presents the package in a much better light. I know we probably ask everyone to pour their can into a glass and really enjoy the aroma and etc. when it comes to craft beer, but there's still a lot of people that drink from cans and bottles of quite, that's the expectation, you're drinking from the bottle. So to have the package presented in the best light is going to, it helps with when someone's putting it to their mouth, you're having a good look at it. So you want to present it in the best light. And I think if you can get that rinsing and those air knives and have it as dry as possible, it always helps.
I thought your point about water spotting just made me think how it can be difficult to dry the top of a can. We employ a twist mechanism in our conveyor that helps get rid of any water that's resting on top. So that's another thing you could employ, and I doubt they're particularly expensive either to put a twist into your conveyor system if you have one.
Yep, I think we do that, and we incorporate that into our coding, so it is handy, turning upside down, giving a good shake, get all that excess water off the top. So that's a really good point. So while we're on the theme of packaging and how it looks and feels to the consumer, I thought we would touch briefly before we finish our discussion on secondary packaging and presentation on the shelf. I think sometimes these are things that get overlooked in discussions, but obviously it's the first thing the consumer sees when they walk into the store or when they're at your brewery. So what would be the key things? Anthony, I'll come to you first, and then I'll talk to you, Thomas, about what you do at Stone and Wood. What are the key considerations for secondary packaging, and what really are the basics that you should be looking out for?
I think it depends a little bit on your process. Obviously, the more automated you are, the less auditing you're doing on the packaging line itself. So if you've got a completely manual back-end process, then hopefully the people that are putting the pack text or putting the 6-packs or 4-packs together and then putting them into the carton themselves, gluing, etc., are actually doing some level of auditing of your packaging to begin with. But it comes down to presentation, doesn't it? So we've really done there's a lot of hard work that's gone into brewing beer and keeping the dissolved oxygen low throughout the process, and then you get it into a retail outlet, and you really want it to present well and make sure that your customers are not shying away because it's got torn or flagging labels on bottles. I guess damaged cans. Poor presentation from the cans, so spotting, labels that are on at weird angles, obviously are not a good look and don't sort of represent a quality product. And then I guess just the gluing process as well. Like in an automated line, you can have all sorts of issues with the glue guns and the jets on the glue guns blocking up or not working. And so you can get a number of cartons just go through with missing or missing glue spots, and therefore the cartons are not are flagging at the ends. And then I guess it's just overall packaging appearance as well. So, are there tears, and is the cartons you're putting the packages into, are they in good shape? Are they, have they been stuck together and then been wet and torn apart, and that doesn't present well as well. So I think it's it's the basic things where you've got glue on packages and heaps of glue or not enough glue. You've got your labelling and torn labels, and then any damage on the package itself. So whether it's dents or issues with the crown seals, etc. So it's that overall package. When you go in to pay, we're paying quite a lot of money for a carton of craft beer. You want to be perceived that you've got, you've paid good money for all your packaging raw materials, and therefore it turns out in a good way. And I think overall appearance and just the materials that have gone into the process, they all look good, and there's no issues with the openings, and it's got some structure. So when you pick it up, it doesn't fall out. Your six-pack doesn't allow a couple of cans to go scooting down the road, or the bottles to fall out. You've got structural integrity there as well. And I know we've talked about it in the past as well, just actually wrapping. I know a lot of craft brewers wrap the pallets, and if the carton ends are not put tightly, and you've got some movement in there, like that can create all sorts of issues once you've transported the beers around as well. So just having that carton integrity in place where there's less movement in the carton, when you pick it up, it feels a little bit more sure. You've not got things rattling around in it. They're all factors that you need to consider. So you can distort the carton when you wrap it really tightly, can't you? So they look a little bit ordinary if you haven't really got the carton sized up correctly and nicely packed. So I think they're all good factors, and ones to look out for when you're out in retail space and you're having a look around at your products. Good one for the sales guys to do, I suppose. They're probably the ones that cop it the most, but I think it's a great exercise to get the operations team out in the workforce and in the retail space and just have a look at what the end product looks like and how does it compare to what you did when you put it, when you put it on the pallet on the day you packed it. So, are you seeing the same things? And you can take some of that information back to the brewery and really optimize your processes from there, I think. So
yeah,
I've covered most things there, Claire.
you have. You've ticked off a lot of the things that I was thinking of, and particularly around those shrink wrapped pallets and sizing, definitely, because whatever space you're going to leave in that carton, once you put that wrap on, that space that it can be compressed and, like you say, misshapen. And also something I think a lot of the time we don't consider when we're choosing our secondary materials, or particularly the grade of cardboard, is, are these going in chillers? Are they going in the chiller part of a bottle shop? How much moisture is that going to introduce to the cardboard? And it's like being delivered a meal in a restaurant or something. The first thing that decides about the quality of the product is what you think the quality of how it looks like. If it looks good on the outside, then subconsciously I'm thinking it's probably good quality on the inside.
Absolutely.
So it might be beer in the world, to your point, but if it's in a tatty box, I'm probably thinking, how good is that beer? Thomas, so on this carton quality, and I know we've talked about tear downs and things, and it's included on the fact sheet, but do you want to just give us a quick overview on what a good tear down should look like? And
sure. I was sort of going to mention, it's something we do routinely. So we take a complete carton off the end of the line and are pulling open the flaps to check that it's not too difficult, that it's not leaving too much cardboard tearing off the seam, so that it's the glue that's breaking less so than the cardboard. And then looking at the condition of the clusters, that they're holding the bottles in fine. So this is something done routinely by our team. I thought it worth mentioning after all these factors that Anthony mentioned, that, you know, a lot of it comes down to awareness and training. A lot of time it's people with less experience that are working on the packaging line. So really getting out there, and we have in each role a sort of quality plan that lists out what we want to be looking out for, and detailing the why. So doing that for these people that often might have turned up for the first time that day to help you pack some product off. And then the final thing I thought worth mentioning is your suppliers will generally really work quite closely with you with any issues that you have. And I know that's not talking so much about how you're packaging, it's about the raw material you're using, but it's still, they generally will work closely with you to make sure that you're satisfied. So be it trying to choose a cardboard that handles moisture better, as you mentioned earlier, or even with glue. There's so many types of glue, and I don't think we become expert. We rely on our supplier to come and tell us what they recommend in terms of what gives the best security in terms of carton seams.
That's absolutely, it's a really good point. I'm glad you've mentioned that. We had our glue guy out only 2 weeks ago, and that's the thing, they really are willing to help. You know, our can suppliers have been super helpful, particularly when we first went to canning. They were helpful in us setting up the micrometer test and explaining to us what we should be measuring. I know your ink coding suppliers, you know, if you're having problems with your ink coding rubbing off, they'll come out, you know, that's a really good tip, like to never be too afraid to contact the suppliers and ask them for help, because that's their bread and butter. And, you know, it's in their interests to make sure that it's working for you. So that's a really excellent tip. Well, I think we've reached the end of today's discussion. I think you could go on forever talking about packaging, but I'm aware that
we haven't even mentioned the ESCI test.
Sorry, what was that, Anthony?
We haven't even mentioned the ESCI test.
Oh, the ESCI test. Go on then, quickly then, and then we'll do a quick.
The most stringent of all tests. How does your package look after it's sat for half a day in cold water? So, yeah, it's we put our beer packaging through some tough environments, and you know it's got to survive some pretty uncharacteristic things that you don't think about when you're first packaging. But yeah, I think getting back to working with your suppliers is the best thing to do, isn't it? If you're having issues, consult your suppliers, because they're there to help. They want you to have the best result as well, don't they? So so they can put your beer in their esky and be quietly confident that everything's going to work.
That's correct. Yeah, before you choose the fancy, crafty looking label, make sure it's going to stay on in the esky and
that's right.
Not soggy. And lovely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Luke, have we got any questions, or are we good to finish up?
We're good to finish up. No questions from the chat, but if people are watching this after the fact, you can check out all the resources on the website under the resources page. There's a lot of good stuff there to explore and have a search around, or just email us at info@iba.org.au if you can't find anything, or if you need more info on anything, and we'll put you in touch with anyone that, or the people that can help out. In the meantime, thank you to the three of you for a really interesting discussion on packaging quality. I feel like there's a lot of things we could pull out and do another 30 to 45 minutes on. So we'll hear from everyone again soon, I'm sure. In the meantime, thanks everyone.
See ya.
Thanks. See you guys.
Bye.